Welcome, everybody. I'm Brian O'Neill. I'm the president of IAFSM. Thank you for tuning in. Take a minute to make a couple of announcements. First of all, if you don't know, our next conference is going to be coming up March of 2022. With all the uncertainty with COVID and all that, the board decided to push that off a little bit just to make sure that we don't plan a conference and then have nobody show up. So around March 2022, we haven't set the date yet, and it's going to be a joint conference with the Association of Crime Scene Reconstruction. So be looking for more info on that and start planning. In terms of this webinar, if you would, make sure you're muted. And for the initial parts, at some point, Joshua is going to open it up to questions, and then by all means, feel free to unmute yourself. But please do make sure you're muted. If you have questions during the presentation, he does have the chat window pulled up. Feel free to ask your question in there, and he will get to it as he can. With that, I would like to introduce Joshua Cohen. It is kind of fun. We actually are from the same area. I first learned about his company from a local newsletter where I saw some of the stuff that he had done. And I went to an open house at his business, Fat Pencil Studio, and was able to kind of get an idea of what he did. He spoke at our last conference. Had a great talk on a couple of interesting cases that he utilized some 3D data, and I saw this presentation he's about to give us. He posted something about it on LinkedIn, and I thought this would be really fun and interesting for IFSM. So I asked him if he would be willing to talk about it, and he was. So with that, Joshua Cohen from Fat Pencil Studios, I will let you take over.
Thank you, Brian. Appreciate the opportunity to spend some time early this morning, at least early this morning, Pacific time, and share a little bit about our work and specifically about a case where we're talking in detail about the differences between animation and simulation. So a little bit more about my background. I own a company called Fat Pencil Studio. We are a design firm based in Portland, Oregon, that focuses almost exclusively on visual tools to help attorneys make a better case. And, you know, a little while ago, here we go. My background is more in engineering and architecture. So I'm fairly recent to the forensics world. I started my career with Fat Pencil working more on construction logistics and transportation planning visualization. But about 10 years ago, started working on forensics and court cases. Actually, the first big case we did was a bus crash case about 10 years ago. And since then, it's come to take over almost all of our business. I think 80% or more of our business at Fat Pencil Studio is related to different kinds of court cases. Not all heavy forensics work, but definitely some each year. And I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge two folks who are going to be familiar to IAFSM members. That's Eugene Licio on the left and Matt Nodell on the right of your screen. And this subject that I wrote the article about, animation versus simulation, was kind of inspired by a talk, or really an interview that Eugene did with Matt several months ago. And you know, in that interview, they talked about the differences between recreation and reconstruction. And these are some of the things I've heard them speak about at IFSM conferences and ACER conferences. I feel like I've had an opportunity to learn quite a bit from both of them over the years. So thank you, Eugene and Matt, for inspiring me to write about this topic. And, you know, recreation and reconstruction really is just another word for another way to say animation versus simulation. And as I was kind of looking for information about that topic, you know, I came across articles that cited lots of court cases. And if you're interested in seeing those, I'm going to send a post presentation list of notes out with links. So don't feel like you have to copy all this stuff down now. Just know that I'll send it out through Kathy later so that everyone can see these. But I'm not going to focus on getting into the weeds about these court cases. instead, I just want to tell you a little bit about the differences between animation and simulation as far as what's to take away from the court cases. And the definition in theory is that animation is I'm just going to stop screen share for 1 second here. There we go. Animation is our computer generated exhibits that help explain the opinion or testimony of a witness. And they're subject to the standard rules of evidence for demonstrative exhibits. In other words, they need to be relevant, they need to be accurate, and they need to be fair. And so that's what a judge would consider as far as the admissibility of an animation. Meanwhile, simulation typically forms the basis for expert testimony. And so because it sort of actually is the exhibit, the simulation is the exhibit, as opposed to just explaining someone's opinion, that simulation will be subjected to a higher standard of evidence, and it must be prepared using generally accepted scientific principles. And those are what you'll see in the literature around precedent in court cases. In theory, it seems pretty simple. A judge would just figure out if something was an animation or a simulation, and then know what standards to apply when ruling on admissibility. But in practice, it's a little more complicated because many exhibits contain elements of both animation and simulation. And so that is what we're going to be talking about today. And I'm going to show a couple different quick videos to get us started on this topic. And we're going to do a chat poll, and I'll explain that in a minute. So let me pull up a screen share here with the video. Here we go. So I'm going to play this video, and what I want to do is ask everyone to type in the chat window after you've seen it for a few seconds, whether you think this would qualify as an animation or a simulation. It's also a test to make sure you can figure out where the chat window is. This will be the place where I think you should type in questions anytime you have them so that I can address those as they come up. And I do apologize if the video is a little choppy. I know internet performance is not the same everywhere. And know that if you didn't get the full motion video, I will be sending links to check these out later if you wanted to revisit. So if you could find your chat window, go ahead and type in, I'll just play it one more time as you're giving a chance to watch. Type in the chat whether you think it's animation or a simulation. I'm seeing a couple animations. Anyone else want to jump in? Okay, animation, good. All right, so I'm seeing some much animations. I'm going to move to the next video now. We got one more to look at. Same thing, sorry, same thing, same subject, but different video. So let's take a look at this one. So now we're switching to the second video. I'll play this a couple times just so you get a chance to see it. All right, replay it once. And if you could type in the chat, what do you think? Animation or simulation? Animation, okay. And in case you hadn't figured it out yet, I'm purposely picking a subject for these to show you that's a little bit outside of what might be everyone's general field of experience. These are prepared for transportation engineers. And the first video, that would be this one, was prepared using software called vSim. So that should give you a clue right there. This is a software that accurately simulates traffic behavior of individual drivers, pedestrians, bicyclists, using user agent logic. So, one car's behavior depends on what the person is doing in front of them. So this would definitely fall in the realm of simulation in the sense that there's a scientific process that's used to create these graphics. Now, the second one is created using a software called Twinmotion, which is architectural visualization software. The vehicles are moving here, certainly. They are a little higher fidelity. The rendering is nicer. And they're doing things like, bumping over train tracks and whatnot. But there's no intelligence applied to the behavior of each of the vehicles. It's all just following paths that we chose for them in the software. So in that sense, it's these videos both tell a story, and you could argue this one perhaps is more visually interesting and appealing. But if the question was, how is the signal behavior in the intersection going to be effective or not effective based on real world transportation behavior, this would not be the right video to use. And so the reason I brought these examples up was to remind everyone that when we were explaining our work in court, or even long before then, to clients and colleagues, it's not always the case that everyone is familiar with the details of the forensic software that we use, and they might pretty much say, oh, it looks like moving pictures or animation. I don't really know if it's simulation. So it's really important to explain and be transparent about how we arrive at different conclusions in our work. So with that, I want to get into this case that we're going to talk about for the article. And it's a case that I worked on a couple of years ago, 3 years ago. It's a bicycle that gets sideswiped by a transit bus, or sorry, a tour bus in Las Vegas. And the case involves a doctor, a hand surgeon. We'll call him Dr. K for this case. And he actually collided with the tour bus and ended up getting run over by the back wheels and died shortly after being transported to the hospital. So when I first saw this case, one of the things that I was looking at was this video that was filmed by a surveillance camera at a casino right at the intersection where the collision took place. So I'm going to play that real quick here so you can sort of see what's on the video. So that's what we got to work with. And of course, it's a little unfortunate that there's this big palm tree right in the way of most of what we would want to see in this video. But what is pretty clear, if you look carefully, is that in this area right here, there's nothing on the road before the bus passes. And then after the bus passes, there's a guy laying on the ground right here. That's Dr. K, and his bicycle is right next to him. And there's an object you'll see kind of rolling out. That's his water bottle from his bicycle. So, the first questions that we had talking to the attorneys in this case were somewhat, usual questions, things like, what was the speed of the bus, and did it change lanes through the intersection? But a bigger question is, where and why did the crash occur? And that was a little harder to answer. So some of the things that we do in cases like this, one of the things I often first do is look at, is there anything that we could answer just from a 3D model of the case? And I'm gonna bring that up right now. One of the things that's really useful about doing a 3D model first is it allows a little bit more understanding of the context. It really allows us to really delve in and understand what all is around here, what's going to be important for the case. And one of the reasons we do 3D models first is probably because we can. All of our staff has architectural and construction training, so we're pretty good, even in the absence of detailed laser scan measurements, at making a reasonably decent first pass at a 3D model. Obviously, there's going to be an opportunity to improve the accuracy in areas where it's important. But sometimes doing basic models first will allow us to investigate and maybe get some fast answers to questions like what might be the viewpoint of different witnesses. And we can go ahead and put a camera on somebody's eye position and look at what they might have been able to see at from different perspectives. And while this doesn't definitively answer the question, because there's a lot of opportunity to add accuracy, it often does frame the question and allow us to evaluate what level of accuracy might be needed to answer questions. So for example, if the question was the driver's view obstructed by the side view mirror or the window, well, we better have very accurate measurements of those windows because they're pretty close to his eye position, and then it would greatly affect what he was able to see. So that's some of the things we do early with models. And then when we had a chance to actually visit the site, there was more information that we collected. So in that case, there was a point cloud from a laser scan that was collected that allowed us to add quite a bit more accuracy to the model. Things like exactly where was that security camera on the building, and where were all the poles and trees that we were going to use as reference points to try to match up the frames from the video with the 3D model. And once we did that, we also had a chance to inspect the bus. And so here's a picture of that. These are some folks. Let me just do one thing real quick here. Headphones are always running low on batteries at inconvenient times. And I also want to encourage folks, if you do have any questions as we go along, feel free to type them into the chat windows. I'll be able to see those and respond to them. And we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end too. So back to the site visit, we had a couple folks from a firm called Ponderosa Associates, and they're out in Westminster, Colorado. They were the ones that were hired as an accident reconstructionists on this project and collected both the point cloud, the laser scan of the intersection, and also the laser scan of the bus and detailed documentation of the bicycle that was recovered from the crash. Here's another look at that. But as a footnote, by the way, in case I think people in this group might be interested, there was other experts involved in this case for the defense, and we were working for the plaintiff, but I know at least one of the other experts hired did a drone flight over the intersection and created a point cloud that way. So there's lots of ways to collect this data. But our team certainly was very interested in this scuff mark on the bus that matched up pretty well with the brake housing on the handlebars. And again, we'll look at how that bike is leaning against the bus. So it seemed to suggest that there was contact made between the bicycle and the bus at that point. And with that information in mind, it gave us another thing to look at in this video. Because remember, we were looking at the video and couldn't figure out really where the bike hits the bus. It's sort of obscured by the trees. But since if you know where to look, you have a feeling somewhere in this area around that front wheel well, there had to have been contact between the bicycle and the bus. And we don't see it here. And so I was going back through the video to try to figure out where does it happen. And we're not going to see anything back here from there on because of the tree. So it's really just these few frames here. And what I started noticing is that there was a dark shape that is in that area of the front wheel well that is moving in a way that's not consistent with that palm branch. And so that was the clue to realize there's actually, we are seeing at least a profile of the bicycle. It wasn't apparent earlier. And here's a closer look at those frames. Let me make it bigger here for you. And so that was a really key piece of information for us, because it allowed us to put some boundaries on the where the collision happened, and what might have happened between that collision and ultimately where the body ended up on the ground. So the next step is to get more detail into our model. And you can see we're using software called SketchUp for this project. We generally use SketchUp for all of our initial 3D modeling, in part because it's so easily to extend and use with a variety of other software. But there's quite a bit you can do even inside of SketchUp. And one of the things you can do is bring in various images to match up with the model. And so I'm going to show you one of those, an example of how that works. We'll go to this frame here. And I can sort of go back and forth between the model, which is here. Here's our 3D model. And here's the image. And one of the things that we're doing with this is, I'll just show you what it looks like when we turn on both of them at the same time, is we're trying to be really careful about identifying the things that are important to get a good match between a photograph and a 3D model. Things like reference points that appear at various places throughout the field of view, not just things that are close to the camera or only things that are far from the camera, but sort of things in the foreground, midground, and background throughout the field of view, while also acknowledging that we're not actually matching to a perfect digital twin, if you want to call it that, of the intersection. There's no point cloud in this SketchUp model. There's only things that we've put there based on the measurements from the point cloud. And it was my judgment that we didn't need to really worry about things that were happening out here on the right side. And so I didn't bother to model the exact shape of the roadway, which is going downhill at this point. So that's why the sidewalk that you see here in the model sort of drifts off from the photograph, because this sidewalk is going downhill, but the model is flat. But we put a lot of effort into things like the shape of the building, the location of trees and other vertical elements to make sure that we could get an accurate match between the camera and the model. And once we had that, it was possible to then place this component for the bus at the locations where it appears in each video snapshot that we matched to the model. And that bus component was also informed by the laser scan of the bus. So the details such as the length, width, and height were all carefully measured and put into the 3D model. So that's a little bit more about the photo matching process. And then once we had that photo match, it allowed us to put the bicycle at the location where it looked like it was making contact with the bus in those frames, and kind of come up with a clear, just looking at my outline here. Okay, so what we got was essentially this location where we know we felt like we're pretty confident that's where the initial contact between the bus and bicycle happened. And this location where there was agreement among the experts that the bicycle, the rider made contact with the rear tire. And then the final position, which was known because you see in the video where the body ends up. And there's also evidence on the ground to suggest that's the case. So it's really between those two things that we had to work through the details with the experts about what happened in between the initial contact and the final resting place. And that's where the expert opinion was important in this case. So what's next? We had to write up a report for our work, which was mostly related to the photogrammetry aspect, the photo matching, as well as the 3D visualization. And one thing that I think it's really important to note is that if this work is scientifically valid, then you'd expect that other people who were maybe following a different methodology but using the same initial facts would come up with a comparable solution or a comparable result. And that, in this case, was something that did happen because there were other experts that worked on the case. And I'm just going to pull up real quick one report by a firm out of Houston, expert named Ricoba. And they used a different software. They used 3D Studio Max to do their work. And you can see that they also identified these frames where the profile of the rider is visible. And we're focusing in their report on which lane the collision occurred in. And so you can see a snapshot of 3D Studio Max with the lanes sort of painted on the ground here, so we can see better what lane the bus was in. And then also here's a path of the bus. And in fact, looking in our model, we had similar results. Let's go ahead and close this. So here's the bike lane, and here's the travel lane, the first travel lane. The bus is moving into the second travel lane. The collision occurs right in the middle of that first travel lane, and sort of switching back to this page in the Ricoba report, it's comparable. There's some minor differences based on which frame that they chose for the collision to happen in terms of the progress on the road, but it's basically the same spot. And then in terms of the path of the bus, this is what we got from matching the photos, frames of the video, and here's what they got in this one. So moving from the first travel lane over to the second travel lane as it moves through the intersection, and that's the same profile that we got for our case in our work. So I felt comfortable that the methodology was valid, and of course the story you tell will vary depending on which side you're working on. And I just, when I say the story you tell, I'm talking about the attorneys. They're going to choose what things that they want to focus on. So I'm going to just pause here for a second and remind people to exercise their chat window with another quick poll, and that is, how often do you in your work report findings that agree with opposing experts in a case? In other words, you go to trial and you get to see the reports done by opposing experts. I'm curious, do your results agree with opposing experts rarely, often? So I'm going to get some results on that. And while I'm waiting for people to type in whether it's rarely or often that your opposing experts have similar results, I'm going to answer Jason's question regarding the camera match. Did you do anything to correct for camera lens distortion, or was it even significant or necessary? So that's a good point. I'm glad you brought that up, and let me bring that up on screen. Let's look at the video. Okay, so this particular camera was a it was a zoom lens security camera that's actually user activated. So in fact, if we were to watch the whole video that looked at the aftermath of the crash, you would see the operator of the all the cameras at Red Rock pan and zoom into a particular spot so they could try to see better what was going on with the response to the collision. So we didn't know the exact focal length of the camera at the time that these shots were taken, but what I can tell from looking at the image was that you don't see a lot of the distortion that's kind of a hallmark of what's typical with outdoor security cameras, where they're really trying to, well, actually, I think most security cameras really go for the wide angle view, which will tend to distort things at the edges. That's not showing up so much here. You see the things that you'd expect to be straight, like the curbs, are pretty straight. And you don't see like dramatic curves in the vertical elements more than what you'd expect with a tree. So for that reason, there wasn't a lot of need to correct this set of images for lens distortion. However, that would be a standard part of our process in cases where it is necessary. And I can actually mention that we've worked on cases where the amount of distortion in the area that we're interested in is so much that we felt that this photo matching process is really not likely to yield an accurate result, and we recommended a different approach. Like, for example, you can, if you have access to that camera, it might be possible to come to the scene later and lay out some calibrated measurements or landmarks in the same video that you could superimpose with the original footage to help you measure things that way. So an important thing to think about in any project is whether there's a need to correct for lens distortion, and whether you can even get accurate results with this method, depending on where you're interested in. There's always less effects from lens distortion in the middle of an image than there would be at the very edges. Okay, so I didn't get a ton of results on that chat poll. It looks like Brian says rarely do his results agree with the experts. I've seen both, and I think it's important to look at that in cases and be aware of different methods that people are using, and how what it says about the work that we do. So Ali W says, do you have a margin of error in terms of distance calculations? And I think one of the things about the method we use is that because it's relying heavily on what I would call visual process. In other words, if I am going to pick a frame here to look at, let's go back to the scene where we're superimposing. So in order to match up the camera and then put the bus in, we're not using a computer algorithm to spit out a number for what the match should be and where the bus should go. We're actually doing that by visual inspection. And so for that reason, it's difficult to just like push a button and get a margin of error that's a number. So what I tend to do in this situation is look carefully at what are the margin of errors in the underlying information that we're using to arrive at these results. So we have the laser scan that was used to build the 3D model. There's a margin of error with the laser scan instrument that's very small, and on the order of probably millimeters to centimeters, which at that level is not really relevant to the work that we're doing. Then there's the margin of error of taking measurements out of the laser scan, which is nothing because we have to pick points to measure between, and so that's probably a little bit larger. And then the most significant margin of error would be the fact that we're limited on the resolution of the camera. And so, if I have a sort of pixels in this camera, well, they're not, they have a dimension, and I could calculate that dimension if I wanted to. But we take a little bit of a different approach, and that is to say, is the margin of error for the pixels in the camera when compounded with other smaller errors relevant to the question we're trying to answer? And so let's say if the margin of error for pixels in the camera and matching them up with things is plus or minus 2 inches, just for sake of argument. Is that going to be highly relevant to the question that we are trying to answer? In this case, not so much. I mean, this case was more about what was the path of the bus to the intersection. So, if we're off by, 3 or 4 inches in one direction, that's not really relevant to answering the overall questions in the case. It would affect the speed a little bit, but this wasn't a case about speed limits. It was more a case about trying to understand how a collision happened. And what the biggest thrust in the case was about the product design of the bus, which I'll get into in a minute. However, that being said, there are cases where margin of error, is sort of in and around the same sort of significant digits as the question you're trying to answer. And that is an area where I would be very careful about saying, like, this is a scientifically valid result. And we might be cheating more into the realm of, this is a scenario, but we can't be sure this is the right one. And if you're transparent about that up front with both the attorneys and ultimately the folks who are evaluating the work, I think that is important to do. I also know there are software out there, like, for example, I think I've seen a lot of information about using Input Ace to match video footage with PointCloud, and I think highly of that work, and they will calculate a margin of error for you based on the component errors that are going into that work. So that could be another approach if you feel like it's really important to get a hard number. But I would caution folks against just like spitting out a number and figuring that's it, and as long as we're not right inside that number, we're fine. I think it's really important to think about the sort of levels of scale and what questions you're trying to answer when you're quantifying the error. So that was a long answer. I'd be interested to hear what other folks have on that topic when we get into the discussion. But let me move on to the next thing that we looked at in this case, which is the things that were most important for our clients who are trying the case was less about liability of the driver of the bus, more about the manufacturer of the bus and what kinds of things they might have been liable for in terms of failure to warn or dangerous products. So there was really 4 things. Let me see if I can bring them all up here. And we did these diagrams not to suggest that this is exactly what a proximity sensor looks like, a proximity sensor system, but just to help the attorneys and their experts explain what their key issues were to the jury. So the first of those key issues was the fact that this bus was not equipped with any kind of a proximity sensor system that could have warned the driver that there was a bicycle in close proximity and maybe prompted that driver to move over to the adjacent lane, which actually in Nevada, there is a law in the books that requires drivers of vehicles to move over to an adjacent lane when passing a bicycle if such a move is feasible, which in this case it was. And then, as far as the visibility from the coach itself, the obstructions that you see for the driver in terms of the console inside the bus as well as the side door panels are fairly high and result in limited visibility of objects that are close to the bus as they're passing. And then there was a big question about the aerodynamics of the bus and how a body moving through air can lead to a low pressure area right near the front tire that would have served to actually suck the bicycle rider toward the bus and the location where the contact was made. And then finally, there was a product on the market that this bus did not have, but is equipped on many buses in Europe. And that's a guard that's placed directly in front of the rear tires to keep objects from getting swept in there and crushed. And this is an object that, had it been installed, in this case, the experts found that Dr. K would have come out with a nasty headache or a concussion and road rash, but probably not been killed by the crushing damage of the tire. And so those are the things that the plaintiff's attorneys were focusing on this case. And the work that I did for trial was to really just explain how the visualization work, how it was set up. The jury, we wanted to see, both how we came up with how we got the bus path, how everything is how the 3D visualization works, But also, the attorneys were really interested in figuring out, could we use this tool to demonstrate different scenarios for why the collision might have occurred. So we know that the rider hit the bus, but we don't really know why, at least not from the evidence that we had in this case. And so, mocking up what happened kind of before the collision became a really interesting thing to look at. So we know kind of what happened, where the collision happened, but going backwards, where was the bus before that? And that's where we, testing out different scenarios became really interesting. And one of the things that we did was looking at some evidence that was provided by eyewitnesses. And actually, I think that the work that we did in testimony, well, let me explain that first, I guess. So, one of the things I like about SketchUp quite a bit is the ability to make real-time adjustments to positions of objects. It's very simple to do, and it's actually fairly feasible to do it during meetings live. And so we had testimony from eyewitnesses about the position of the bicycle and the bus just prior to entering the intersection, and we were able to test that and look at different scenarios as they move forward. So it's like, if they were here and then they were here and then the bus is back here, what's that going to look like? And then we can put a camera on one of these witnesses and sort of see what are these witnesses, would they have been able to see that? So we can position a camera here. So we can put a camera at that eye position and sort of look around and see, what is he going to be able to see that bicycle rider through the window? And so that's the kind of thing where, being able to test these things in real time, it was useful for the attorneys as they were doing their early work on the case. And they wanted to try to do that in court. And I've used SketchUp before in court to explain how we came up with our opinions and just demonstrate the 3D model. This was the first time an attorney asked me to actually just real time test out different scenarios and move objects around real time in front of the jury. And that was sort of led to this question: is the 3D model itself admissible as an exhibit in the trial? And the ruling from the judge was that yes, the 3D model could be admissible for real-time demonstration and trial if the opposing counsel was given the same opportunity to ask questions of me to test out the scenarios that they wanted to see. And they had other positions that were reported by other witnesses. So for example, there's these witnesses over here on these bicycles that reported this kind of the setup, but then the witnesses in the bus reported a little bit of a different setup of the bicycle further in this, more like this location. And so we could test, what would have been visible from this location, and does that make sense? And all this kind of played out over the course of a couple hours of testimony and cross-examination and looking at different scenarios. And I was concerned that as a juror, looking at all these images, it would be confusing to know what is based on the scientific process and what is just pure speculation. And so that was one of the things that I talked about during sort of the introduction of the work and the questioning related to my qualifications and background, was just to say, listen, to all the jurors, you're going to see some 3D visualization, and it's important to understand that that's a different, the 3D visualization is different from photogrammetry and the scientific process that's at work to determine where the bus is. So you're going to see some things that are based on a scientific process, and that's what is the bus path through the intersection. and in the placement of the, where the bicycle ended up, and also where the collision occurred. And then you're going to see some things that are based on witness statements, like this position here. And then you're going to see some things that are really just speculation, in a scenario that an attorney wants to explore. What would have happened if at this point the bicycle moved in front of the bus, and what would that have looked like? And the important thing is to just understand that just because you're seeing a picture on screen doesn't make it true. You have to evaluate the underlying foundation and evidence for that scenario to decide if that's something to use in terms of making up your mind on a case. And I like to give jurors credit. They're pretty smart. They were definitely engaged during this presentation in court. So I feel like they were able to make those distinctions and evaluate for themselves. And I think they appreciated really seeing some of what's under the hood rather than just relying on me spouting my qualifications, which, to be honest, I don't have a PhD or tons of publications under my belt, so I wasn't going to use that anyway as a way to try to convince them that this is the right stuff. I like to fall in the camp of sharing that story and letting them, giving them the tools they need to evaluate the evidence for themselves. So what was the outcome of this case? The case was a verdict for Dr. K and his family in the amount of $18.7 million. And I was on the stand for just about 2 hours in a month-long trial process. So I don't like to take a huge amount of credit for what I did in court for that. I mean, I think that there was a lot of other factors in this case than what we did. But I think there were some other ways that our work was probably even more valuable than what I happened to do on the stand. And I showed you before these images that helped the attorney sort of organize his thoughts about how they wanted to focus the case on product liability issues. So those were helpful, and they were used at different points in the case with different witnesses. And then early on in the case, we did some work with video synchronization. There was a video shot by a bystander, and then here you can see the kind of zoomed in, or the not yet zoomed in, but the aftermath of the crash. And the police in this case, they really interviewed just a few witnesses on the bus. They didn't bother to get some of the other people that were first responders to the incident as part of their scene investigation. So our clients are able to, based on this sort of reconstructed synchronized video with 911 audio, identify a couple additional witnesses and reach out to them and get them for deposition. So that was really helpful. And then another thing we did early on was create an intersection map. And you can sort of see here the level of detail with that, with some lines across the street indicating 50-foot increments back from the intersection. And the impetus for that was that the attorney had purchased a die-cast motor coach bus, 1:50 scale, and wanted a scaled map to move that around on. And I explained to them that at that scale, their poster board would be about 12 feet long. And he said, okay, no problem, we can do that. And so we made this really large poster board that they used in their conference room for depositions. And you could see the head witnesses putting a bicycle and a bus on that map, and they took pictures of it. And that formed the basis for us of identifying where to put the bus and the bicycle for those witness recollections and look at those from different perspectives. And it's just a much better way of getting that information than, for example, trying to ask people to draw freehand that information. The other thing that was really interesting to me is that they brought this large poster board and die-cast bus and little bicycle icon into trial and set it up on a card table, actually 2 card tables right in front of the jury box. And I feel like the time I was there in court, the attorney came back to that table and moved the bus around numerous times. And I can only imagine they did that frequently throughout the trial, just to kind of make the whole location more tactile and emphasize the large relative size of the bus to the bicycle. So I think that was an effective strategy for them. And then the other thing I think that was really helpful was this ability to work with different experts to help them coordinate what they were finding. So we had the accident reconstruction team that helped us with the laser scan. They were talking about the details of where the crash occurred and where the body ended up on the ground. There was a different expert that was hired to look at biomechanics and how the body was likely to have fallen from the bike. And they were really concerned about the crush damage to the helmet and how that would inform the position of the body as the fatal impact occurred. And so you can see here that we've mapped some red area on the helmet. This is not meant to represent blood or something like that, but it was a tool that we used when working with the experts to move this object around in real time. Let me see if I can do that here. Let's go to that. So you can see here, and I'm going to just move this away from the, we had on the helmet this crush damage mapped out. And so that between that and also some evidence of road rash on the arms, those were important tools to help the biomechanics expert sort of figure out what position was most reasonable for the body to be in just prior to impact. So there was the need to position this crushed area of the helmet underneath the tire, as well as position this arm here in contact with the pavement. And so that is what informed this particular exhibit. And so having all that and being able to work through those issues in relation to an actual, an accurate model of the intersection was really helpful, because none of the experts were doing their work in a vacuum. They were able to communicate in their findings and have them make sense in the overall context of the case. And then finally, we helped put together some other little exhibits. This was an exhibit that was put together to talk about proximity sensors and what the zone of those sensors was and how it would have operated to detect a bicycle. And you can sort of see what the limits of those sensors are. There was another set of slides we put together to talk about aerodynamics of different vehicles and the profile of those shapes. So a lot of little things that came together, and that is the majority of the prepared work that I've got. And I wanted to take a second here just to, before we kind of conclude the talk, and see what other questions people might have. And maybe we can open up for another quick chat poll, which is to say, now that you've seen the totality of work that we put together for this case, do you think there's is it all animation work, or is there some simulation in terms of a scientific process, or is it both? I'd be curious either to see your responses in the chat, or I'd also be happy to take questions in the chat. Or I think at this point, if anyone wants to share any work that they did in a case that reminds them of experiences you've had, I'd be interested in hearing that too. Let me see if I can see the participant list here. And I think we're small enough that if anyone wants to unmute and just talk, we can do that. But also, where is the participants? There we go. Got it.
Joshua, I'll ask a quick question. This is Brian.
Hey, Brian.
With the die-cast model,
yeah.
I know this case was probably a little while ago, or at least the prep for it. But with the prevalence and the ever-developing 3D printing, is that something that you think would have been more impactful to do an actual 3D print of the bus, or don't know, I guess what's your opinion on the whole 3D printing in use in court and that sort of stuff?
Yeah, I got lots I could share about that. Number one, we actually did talk about doing a 3D print in this case, and the reason for that is because they had an aerodynamics expert that was hired to talk about this air blast idea, and this expert had access to a wind tunnel, and there's actually some talk about doing a series of specific tests on this bus, like taking the laser scan, creating from that laser scan a very detailed 3D printed model that could be brought into a wind tunnel, and then doing some tests in relation to other, there's been some research done in literature about similar buses, and so having a way to test this particular bus. In the end, we didn't do it. I think that there was a couple problems. One was we were just running out of time before trial, and the other was it's not actually that easy to get from a PointCloud scan of a bus to a model that can be 3D printed. And the reason is because you can't 3D print a whole bunch of points. You actually have to have it's called a mesh model, and creating a mesh model with no holes is not necessarily a straightforward process. And you can't, a 3D printing model has to be what's called watertight. There can't be any holes because then it doesn't know what to print there. So that was the first thing. And then as far as having something for the an exhibit for manipulation, I think that the die-cast model was sufficient. There was no, at that scale is really meant to represent the scale of the object as opposed to a fine detail that would be informed by the laser scan and 3D print. But there have been other cases where we have done 3D prints. Like we had a case of we worked on a case about some bridge piers, and ended up creating a 3D print of the inside cutaway model of the anchors for that bridge pier, because you can't very well take a bridge pier into court, much less cut away the concrete and look at the anchors inside. But it was a useful tool to have it you could hold in your hand and look at it carefully. So I think the idea of bringing a physical object into court is a really good one, and it was used well in this case with the die-cast model. But I think there could be other situations where a 3D print would be really helpful, and I think that the tools that are going to be coming down the pike to allow us to get from a photogrammetry or a scanned model into a watertight model that can be 3D printed are only going to get better. Does that do a good job of answering it?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. It's 9 o'clock, and if anyone needs to jump off and head out, that's totally fine. But I'd be happy to answer other questions, or if anyone else has other experience that they'd like to share that was similar or relevant, I'd love to hear it.
Hey Josh, I had a quick question. This is Jason.
Hey Jason.
You mentioned early on that the model was not created from the laser scan. Is that correct? It was just the laser scan data was just helped to refine some of the distances and the position of the camera?
That's correct, and today that's how we do most of our work. And Ali's got a similar question. Can you describe the process of PointCloud to model? So usually, unless we know for sure that we are definitely going to be having a laser scan, or sometimes in cases where it's a criminal case, the laser scan might already have been done. And if we have access to that, we might just go right into the process of bringing up the laser scan, identifying the key measurements, and then using that to inform the creation of the model in SketchUp. And so just to take another look at that laser scan that we had for this case, that's here. And all these measurements that you see in here is somewhat indicative of our process. We're manually picking out things that we need to know. Like, this is all measurements that we took to be quite certain about the precision of that camera in relation to other things that we see in its field of view. So we're repeating this process through, for a lot of other things that we felt were really important in this case, things that were going to be landmarks for matching the video from of the bus going through the intersection to that 3D model. So mostly like prominent vertical elements that are clearly visible in that camera footage. We wanted to know the exact position of those so that we could be sure that we are doing a good job of matching those frames from the video. Now, could you have converted this model to a 3D mesh and put it in SketchUp? That's possible. The results, certainly at the time we did this, we didn't have great tools for that. More tools are coming into, are becoming available. But one of the problems that I have with high detail mesh models is that they're not as fast to manipulate and work with as the SketchUp model, and I really like having that sort of human, the opportunity to have some intelligence go into where you want to add the detail to the model and where it's not so relevant to the questions we're trying to answer. The other thing I will say is there's good tools for bringing information into a PointCloud environment, and those are, we're constantly evaluating those to see, can we, for example, take a 3D scan of a crime scene and bring in human figures and manipulate those figures in the context of a 3D model. So that's where I really value the interactions with this group to sort of see what's the state of the art, what are other people doing, because there's going to come a time when it becomes much easier to do that sort of work real time with our clients and colleagues, and we might switch over to that sort of tool in some cases. Does that give a good explanation for what we're doing on PointCloud?
Yeah, absolutely. One tool that kind of came across my desk a couple weeks ago was a plugin for SketchUp made by Trimble, and it's Trimble Scan Essentials for SketchUp. Yeah. And it allows you to import the laser scan data. You don't need to create a mesh model from it, but it allows you to import the actual laser scan data into SketchUp, and you can model directly from the laser scan data. And I've kind of been beta testing it in a couple cases, and man, it makes some of that modeling, because I was trained in SketchUp as well, so right. It made some of that organic modeling and stuff so much easier. And it has functions where you can select either the laser scan points or select the SketchUp architecture behind the laser scan points and kind of toggle on and off between those two functions. And I found it just sped up my workflow tremendously.
Excellent. So yeah, I think it's Windows only at this point. Is that true?
I'm sure. I do use a Windows machine, so that's a good question.
So that's a little bit of a hang up for us, because we are mostly Mac-based shop, but gotcha. We do have a Windows machine, and I am aware of that. So I'm glad to hear you're having a good experience with that, because I think we may want to try it on cases where we have laser scan, and oftentimes we'll use Autodesk Recap to do the work of sectioning and measuring things in a laser scan, but having two windows open is a little bit time consuming. So being able to bring it into the modeling environment can be helpful. So I'm glad to hear you're having a good experience with that. That's something we should check out.
And it's relatively inexpensive too. I think it's like $550 for the plugin, as opposed to right. Some of the other things that are out there.
Right. And that's, maybe a good opportunity to plug SketchUp too for folks that maybe just getting into this space. I think 3D Studio Max is what the opposing expert used in this case, and that's real commonly used for bringing together imagery and 3D modeling to do photogrammetry work. It's quite expensive. SketchUp is much more affordable. So your price point is going to be like $200-300 a year, I think, is the entry level price on SketchUp Pro. So it's just a little easier to get started with if you're not looking to have a huge outlay of funds into new 3D modeling software, and it's the learning curve is pretty easy compared to some others software. But there's a lot of great other software out there, and I encourage people to stay engaged with this group, because I've just learned a ton about photogrammetry software and other tools for investigating crime scenes and crashes from folks in this group. And maybe I will conclude here with, first of all, I'll just drop our phone number up here again on screen. And if anyone has questions for a case and you just want to chat about it, I welcome you to give me a call. Happy to do it. And in terms of the question we ended with, as far as the chat poll, was the work in this case animation, simulation, or both? I mean, I think there's definitely elements of each of those. And so the way I answer that question when people ask, are you going to do an animation or a simulation? What I try to impress on them is that computer generated animations, they're really most effective if they're based on an accurate model that incorporates all the relevant evidence. So I try to counsel attorneys not to go down this road of, we're going to make a movie where all the things that are happening are the way we want them to be. But instead, to really create these visual tools in the context of things that to be true, that where you can see all the evidence for the case right there in the model you're developing. And conversely, if someone's saying, well, are you going to is this going to be a simulation? I think that it's really important to remember that simulation is most effective when it's presented as part of a compelling visual presentation, as opposed to, here's a chart that shows my data, or here's an image that shows the answer. I think having it be, part of a story, and the story is developed with the context and, with whatever relevant information that a jury or other fact finder might need to know to understand how it was created is really important. So being transparent about, what questions you're trying to answer and what are the limitations on the accuracy that your method has are really things to think about. And I want to make one other comment about the accuracy of the methods we use, because I think that it's something that comes up a lot in sort of discussion about, what is the relevant, is this scientific process one that can be relied upon? And that is that, in any method you might use, while you'd expect it to be to get comparable results as other tools, there's going to be differences in both the operator, you call it operator error, or operator choices, and there's going to be differences in in how different software sort of deals with information and represents it. So I've been really impressed by some of the work that Eugene Licio has done in calibrating different methods that they've used. And I encourage folks in IAFSM and ACER to keep working together and look for opportunities to, take the cases where you might be able to look at two different approaches to the same, to evaluating the same evidence, and see, what are the differences that you come up with using different methods, and is there some calibration that can be done that would then later inform testimony you give on the stand, like this method has been tested in this way, and we have these empirical results to know how accurate it was at finding the answer in comparison to a known quantity. So I'm interested in doing that work, and I encourage other folks to keep that in mind too. And I think unless anyone else has any other questions, I'd love to wrap it up here and say thanks so much for your attention and for the opportunity to share the story with you this morning. I'll go ahead and send out some post-meeting notes to Kathy, and I think she can get that out to folks who registered for the event. Brian, anything else on your end, or should we wrap it up?
Yes, I'd just like to say thank you, Joshua, for doing this. That was fantastic. I want to encourage everybody to look around for other folks that could do like Joshua and step up and do a little hour webinar. We love doing these for the membership. I know nobody likes to volunteer themselves. So if you know someone that's doing something, feel free to, let us know and we'll approach them and ask them to do it. Joshua didn't step up and say, hey, I want to do this. It was me kind of tracking him down, and he was more than willing when asked. So I think people are willing, and this is what this organization is all about, is sharing ideas and learning. And with a conference not being until 2022, I want to make sure that we do whatever we can to ensure that we continue that dialogue and are able to meet up and see each other, whenever we can. And as a reminder too, this is being recorded and will go up on the member section. I know we had, I think it was over 30 people registered. And so in this line of work, we all know that you think you've got time, and then that phone call happens, and you're not able to chime in. So we do have a lot of webinars. All the webinars are up on the members only portion of our website. So make sure you log into that and check that to find stuff. And that's where we'll post the links to what Joshua was talking about. So that stuff will be there probably in a couple of days. So other than that, I have nothing. Kathy, anything before we go?
No, thank you everyone for attending and taking time out of your day. And Joshua, thank you. This was wonderful. We really appreciate it. And just to repeat what Brian said, this was very informative, very helpful, I'm sure. So if you know anyone that would be willing to do this, just have them email me and send me a message. We'd be happy to get something coordinated. But Joshua, thank you so much for your time too.
Hey, thank you. It's been a pleasure. Take care.